Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Real Talk program. It's called Protect Honesty in Education, the Impact of Partisan Politics on Ohio Education. I will be your moderator for the evening. My name is Jenny Hamill. I am the education reporter for Ideastream Public Media. I have done a lot of reporting on equity in education in the state of Ohio, and for the last 2 years, much of the discussion and reporting has been on the pandemic's impact on students, teachers, and staff. I've also done a lot of reporting on the issues we're going to be exploring tonight over the past year, how certain issues within education look very different depending on what side of the political aisle you are standing on. So before we move on, we need to thank Real Talk's incredible community partners and contributors who help bring this and other important issues into sharp focus. Real Talk is a diversity, equity, and inclusion program that addresses inequities and disparities in education, criminal justice, public health, and democracy. Real Talk is hosted by 4 leagues of women voters in Northeast Ohio, Akron, Hudson, Greater Cleveland, and Kent, in strong partnership with Ideastream, WKSU, the Akron NAACP, and the Freedom BLOC. Tonight, we especially want to thank the Honesty for Ohio Education Coalition, the Akron NAACP, and the Freedom BLOC for their leadership and advocacy that is driving tonight's discussion. We also want to thank our presenters from the Speak Coalition, the Ohio Poverty Law Center, the State Board of Education, and of course, Cleveland Heights University Heights School District. So let's take a look at tonight's discussion. First, we're going to open with a look at education across the country in terms of legislation and actions to restrict and ban education around racism and sexism. Then we're going to narrow our focus to Ohio and look at 3 battlegrounds over what's being taught in our classrooms in education at the Statehouse, the State Board of Education, and our local school districts. Then we will have a discussion with all of our presenters about the impact of partisan politics on education in their respective spaces. Finally, we're going to offer some concrete ways you can take action on a state and local level. But first, we open tonight's program with 2 speakers who offer unique perspectives about what honesty in education is and why everyone is fighting to defend it at all costs. Laura Kohler is no stranger to the intersection of partisan politics and education. She was featured on the Real Talk program back in February to talk about the resolution to condemn racism and advance equity. Tonight, we discuss why that framework was ultimately repealed and why Laura was forced to resign from her post as president of the Ohio State Board of Education in October due to political pressure. Originally appointed to the board by Governor John Kasich in 2017, she was reappointed by Governor DeWine to a second term in 2021. She is, as always, an advocate for equitable opportunities for all students, high expectations, and effective community partnerships. We also will meet now Kayla Blake. She is a high school senior at John Hay, the Cleveland School of Science and Medicine. Kayla is also an active member of the Speak Coalition that advocates for honesty in Ohio education and against attempts to prohibit and censor education. Kayla is here to speak her truth and lend clarity to what truly matters in education, the student. So I'd like to welcome you, Laura, and glad to have you, and I appreciate your leadership. So now, looking across the nation, Ohio is not alone in these assaults against honest education. As of December 8th, 29 states have enacted or introduced bills, and actions in their state houses, boards of education, and local districts to restrict, censor, or ban education around racism, sexism, and identity. Now, I'm going to go into this further, but I've jumped ahead of myself, and now we're going to hear from Laura Kohler, who is going to talk about what's been happening in her hemisphere over the last year. Laura, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jenny, and thanks very much to the League of Women Voters and all of the impressive list of partners that the League is working with tonight. So I'm honored that I've been asked to join you this evening, as this particular topic, the impact of partisan politics on education in Ohio, is so very important to me, certainly as a former state board member, but also as a mother, a grandmother, and as a very concerned Ohio citizen. I appreciate you giving me your time and your attention this evening to what is clearly happening not in, but to education in Ohio at this critical juncture. The State Board of Education, as Jenny said, is one part of the story, but other insidious activities are taking place in local school districts, and most concerning of all, by legislators in Ohio's General Assembly. Shockingly, hard to believe, I know, but there are those who care more about power and political dogma than they do about students. I'm sharing my story with you tonight because I believe that I was a canary in a very dangerous mine. Such is the influence of partisans that I was removed from my position by my own party. My crime? As Jenny noted, I continue to support a resolution passed by the State Board of Education that condemns racism and advances equity and opportunity for students of color. I'm a former member of the State Board of Education, and as Jenny said, I was appointed to a second four-year term by Governor DeWine. I'm a lifelong Republican, and I was elected president of the board for two-year terms by my peers on the board, a choice that actually the governor supported. And as recently as this past October, mid-October, the governor's office was pleased with my leadership, recognizing the challenge of maintaining a moderate course with a polarized board. On October 28th of 2021, however, I was asked by DeWine to resign because I was told Senate President Matt Huffman had the votes to keep me from being confirmed. Appointed board members serve at the pleasure of the governor, so not resigning was not an option. So what caused this change in direction? As Jenny alluded to, in July of 2020, the board passed the landmark resolution to condemn racism and to advance equity and opportunity for Black students, Indigenous students, and students of color. At the board's October 2021 board meeting, a newly elected member introduced a resolution to rescind it. And despite knowing that Senator Huffman and primary and secondary education chair, Senator Andrew Brenner, were both opposed to the original resolution, I was one of two appointed board members to vote against rescinding it. Eric Kohler, who was the other appointed board member who voted against the motion to rescind, was also asked to resign. Interestingly, the original July 2020 anti-racism resolution was passed by close to a 4-to-1 margin, with all of the appointed Republican members voting yes. So what happened in 15 months to have produced such an abrupt retreat from the board's commitment to condemning racism and advancing equity? One word: politics. The resolution, as those of you who were part of the Real Talk presentation that we had months ago, it was written in the aftermath of the senseless death of George Floyd. And it recognized that part of the change needed to prevent similar tragedies lies within the control of our schools. Educators cannot change the stability or economic circumstances of our students' families, nor can they guarantee students a safe roof over their heads and a meal on the table, but they can and should impact what happens at school. Ohio's stated goal is to ensure that our students leave high school prepared to be successful in additional education, a career, service in the military, or a self-sustaining vocation. However, as the resolution notes, tens of years of disaggregated achievement data and graduation rate data show significant and largely unchanging gaps between Black and Brown students and their white peers. Clearly, the many sincere efforts to close these gaps had not been enough. We needed to do more. So Resolution 20 affirmed that part of doing more is taking a close look at this vulnerable group of students and recognizing that implicit bias and the propensity to expect students to learn without ever seeing themselves in the curriculum or in their classroom teachers has an impact on student achievement results. Perhaps if policymakers were willing to consider that this group of children might require different supports and resources, we could help more students of color achieve, giving them the opportunity to graduate prepared for wherever their interests take them. Resolution 20 encouraged districts to do their own reflection and internal examination of hiring practices, discipline strategies, classroom resources, and professional development training. It encouraged state board members to learn to identify their own implicit biases and how these biases might impact the board's work. And it directed the Ohio Department of Education to examine learning standards and state-administered tests to eliminate bias. In the vote to rescind Resolution 20, the State Board of Education eliminated these recommendations. The board's Resolution 20 fell victim to partisans who seized it as a weapon to advance a political point of view. In hours of testimony and hundreds of emails, opponents asserted that the resolution endorsed critical race theory, prohibited the teaching of our country's founding documents, was racist towards white people, and was intended to make white children feel guilty about their heritage. They claimed it was leading our schools to socialism, communism, or Marxism. None of these claims is true. Condemning racism, advancing equity, and acknowledging that Ohio must be committed to supporting opportunities for success in each child, regardless of race, creed, or economic status, shouldn't be controversial. Politics, not meeting the needs of children, is driving education policy these days. And what I've learned from this experience is that anyone who doesn't get on board, even fellow Republicans, will be escorted from the arena. Those who are committed to truths such as all men and women and children are created equal, and that those of us with more power or resources or privilege have a duty to insist that all children, indeed all people, have the right to resources that will enable them to experience equal opportunity, must make our voices heard. As you will learn tonight, there are two bills pending in the Ohio House that, if adopted, will censor how our country's history is taught and how student teachers are trained to teach history. School districts cannot, under these new rules, permit obtusely defined divisive topics, and students are at risk of losing course credit if these rules are violated. Partisan politics, not honesty or truth, is driving these initiatives. In order to protect students from feeling guilty about their ancestry or race, some legislators appear to be willing to mandate a single lens through which to view our country's proud but complicated history. Today on CNN, there was a report of a study that found the Proud Boys, which, as you know, is a hate group that featured prominently in the tragedies in Charlottesville and on January 6th at the nation's capital, are changing their strategy and targeting communities at the local level by appearing at school board meetings under the guise of fighting mask mandates. Local boards in Ohio have had to defend themselves from false narratives regarding COVID protocols, critical race theory, and they're also coming under intense pressure for recognizing that emotional health is essential to student learning. Our schools are at risk. Our state is at risk, and our nation is at risk. We have a responsibility to sound the alarm and speak with honesty and passion. If we appear to be complacent, we risk losing the significant progress that has been made towards helping each child understand what makes him or her unique and what will ensure that they are prepared to follow their dreams. We must advocate for balance, for common sense, and for respect for our teachers' professionalism. And we must not allow extreme partisans to underestimate our students' ability to think critically about difficult and complicated issues. On the day of my resignation, I asked the governor's chief of staff to relay a message to Senator Huffman. The message: if the senator thought I was a pain in the rear end as a State Board of Education member, just wait to hear what private citizen Laura Kohler has to say. I will continue to advocate for honesty and truth, for educators and families, and for each and every child. And I encourage you to join me. Thank you very much. I think you're muted.
Thanks so much, Laura, for being the consummate advocate and for sharing your perspective this evening. Now let's garner some perspective from Kayla.
Okay. First of all, thank you, Laura. It was great to hear your story. It was, yeah, I applaud you. But as you know, my name is Kayla. I'm a high schooler and I'm an advocate for honesty in Ohio education. I just believe that it's important for us to have honesty in our education system. Obviously, I don't think there's really that much to it. Honesty is just like a basic thing that, you know, we should present. And I just want to give this my personal perspective as a student in the CMSD school district. So as like a kid, you know, elementary school, middle school, I grew up like learning a baseline for history. Wasn't anything too complicated, you know, just Martin Luther King, Muhammad Gandhi, you know, just the basic events. So we got to very surface level history, but what they failed to do was prove how myself and people that looked like me as an African-American woman, how we were relevant to history. I pretty much grew up just seeing only white faces in history books. And when you see that, you don't see representation, you don't learn how you yourself are relevant in the history books. Later on, I went to high school and I had a teacher, Dr. Adams. He's actually like my favorite teacher, and I took him for 2 courses, and he's an African-American male. So it was just great hearing from a teacher that looked like me and understood myself and my peers. And he also made history fun, and he also taught why history is important. When I was growing up, I always heard, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. But at the time I was young, so I never understood what that was supposed to mean. I just thought people were just saying stuff, making stuff up. But as we looked at events in the past, I looked at how they're very related to stuff that happened just recently or as of now. And it gives direct context to why things are the way they are, why society thinks a certain way, why we view things in the light that we do. So I feel like it's very important to have more representation in our school and education systems, because I feel like that for me was pretty life-changing, just having an African-American male as my teacher, especially the fact that only 4% of teachers are African-American males. That proves that we have a lot more work to do. I think the fact that history gives context to a lot of what's happening today is why a lot of people are trying to hide it. I learned that history is pretty much just the same thing happening over and over again, just with different faces and at different time periods. So if you know history that happened back then, it's pretty much is going to show what's going to happen in the future or prove what's happening right now. I also believe that history should be taught on a deeper level. Just starting at like 1st grade, I learned about Christopher Columbus and, you know, these figures. And I think that if kids can learn about Christopher Columbus in the first grade, that they should learn about history that's actually relevant and more updated. And another thing that I want to address is one of the biggest arguments that the other side makes. They would like to say that kids are too young to learn about complex constructs such as race or gender. However, I did some research, and research shows that at the age of 6 months, kids automatically know the skin color. Actually before the age of 6 months. And at the age of about 4 and the latest 5, kids understand the concept of race and associate races with certain characteristics or stereotypes. And they also can form their friend group around what they believe about these races. So this can lead to children as young as 4 or 5 holding racist ideology and being prejudiced. And then in addition to this, a lot of them don't have guardians that would tell them that this is wrong. So this leads to a big positive feedback loop of basically miseducation. You hold this racist ideology, nobody is telling you that it's wrong, so you just pretty much go through it thinking that it's okay. Another thing I want to address is that Black and brown kids at young ages are, like, we have to learn that racism is real. We are pretty much forced into that. And I think that if we are old enough to experience racism at such young ages, that our white counterparts or our white peers are old enough to learn about it. Just period, you know. Also, not discussing topics such as race won't fix anything, but will just make it more taboo and disrupt conversation on it. This is another form of indoctrination and censorship. And I believe that we should have an education system which makes more fair, school objective curriculum that includes the voices of people of color, people that look like me. So that way we can acknowledge that there's a complex history of America. And unfortunately, racism is built into the fabric of it. You know, the goal is, as the preamble says, is to create a more perfect union, not to act as the current union we have is perfect. Because I'm pretty sure all of us here can agree that it's at least not perfect. We have a lot of work to do as Americans. And lastly, I'm just glad to see that so many people are becoming aware of these issues and are taking a stand. I'm glad to see that everybody's here, and I'm just excited to be a part of this panel and to listen to everybody. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Kayla. You are you're a leader, so know that. And I love that you have the confidence to share your perspective and share your thoughts in a room probably full of adults. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate your perspective because you make a lot of valid points. So thanks, Kayla. And of course, thanks, Laura. So looking across the nation, Ohio is not alone in political attacks on education. As of December 8th, 29 states, so the majority, have enacted or introduced bills and actions in their state houses, boards of education, and local districts to restrict, censor, or ban education around racism, sexism, and identity. Now, look at these numbers. 13 states have enacted these bans. At least 2, Oklahoma and New Hampshire, are facing lawsuits for that legislation. Meanwhile, legislators in Texas released a watch list of 850 books that cause discomfort, guilt, or anguish. And a Texas school district pulled 414 books from its libraries under political pressure. A Texas principal and a Tennessee teacher lost their jobs for calling on their districts to be anti-racist and teaching about privilege. And universities are in the crosshairs as well of this political debate, with the University of Florida restricting its professor from using critical or race together in the curriculum. Meanwhile, over at the University of Oregon, the student government is fighting to make critical race theory an undergrad requirement. Now let's turn our attention to our state, Ohio. We can see very similar activity in our own state house with 2 pending House bills that aim to restrict, censor, and ban education and discussion around race, sex, and identity. One of the bills aims to dole out severe punishments for violations, revoking professional licenses and pulling 100% of state funding from districts. Here to speak more about these bills is Tim Johnson. Tim is the policy advocate for the Ohio Poverty Law Center. He joined the Ohio Poverty Law Center in July of 2019 after having spent 6 years in state government. During his time working for the state, Tim was a staffer to several members of the General Assembly and the senior policy advisor to the Senate Minority Caucus. As an advocate with OPLC, Tim works on education and health policy and other issues impacting low-income Ohioans. So Tim, thanks so much for joining us, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for that introduction. I believe there's a slide deck that is going to pop up shortly. But thank you, everybody, for taking the time to be with us here tonight. We're going to briefly talk about House Bill 322, House Bill 327, the quote unquote divisive concept legislation, sort of the ins and outs of these, how they got here, what they do, and then things that we should be paying attention to. So the first thing that you all should know is that this is a reaction to, as Jenny pointed out, just this national discussion around critical race theory that's really happened over the last year and a half or so throughout the country. Like she said, many states, 29, have taken some action in trying to ban this, and 13 states have either passed bills or implemented bans. Want to be very clear about this concept of critical race theory, at least at what it actually is not something that's taught in K through 12 schools, and it's actually not mentioned in either of the two bills that we'll be discussing tonight, which is interesting, right? Because these bills are a response to this idea of critical race theory, but the actual phrase critical race theory does not appear in either of the bills, but it's absolutely the driving force. And in fact, if you watch any of the testimony given by the sponsors of either of the bills, they talk about critical race theory. Legislators, when they ask questions about this bill, they mention critical race theory, but it's not technically mentioned in either of the pieces of legislation. But most of what they're describing are these conversations and discussions on race that can sometimes be uncomfortable. And that's really the driving force behind this, that there have been over the last year and a half, some really intense discussion in schools, in universities, and other areas about the role race plays in our society, how it affects all of us. And that's really been something that has made a lot of legislators uncomfortable. They don't like some of the conversations that are going on. And so House Bill 322, House Bill 327 has really been introduced to disrupt those conversations. And it's very frustrating as well, because most people don't have a clear definition of what critical race theory is, which has really allowed opponents of critical race theory to paint it to be whatever they would like it to be. And so that's certainly been something that has been incredibly frustrating and has certainly poured over into House Bill 322 and House Bill 327. So the first bill we'll talk about is House Bill 322, introduced by Representative Don Jones and assigned to the House State and Local Government Committee. And that bill prohibits the teaching of what the bill terms to be prohibitive concepts. And they list 11 of these concepts out. And they really run the gamut from things that are absolutely not happening in classroom, things like one person or a group should be discriminated against based on their race or their sex. There are prohibitive concepts that go specifically at certain things that you might see in the media, like the 1619 projects. A prohibitive concept says you can't teach that the advent of slavery in the territory that's now the United States represents its true founding. So this idea that they want to attack the 1619 project. It also goes after things that are pretty controversial and folks have really been trying to discuss and talk about, things such as there is no such thing as unconscious or implicit bias, right? This idea that we all have some sort of, on some level, form of bias, even if we don't recognize that we have them. Well, according to the state legislature in House Bill 322, that's a prohibited concept and you can't teach something like that. The bill also prevents any sort of requirement that a teacher of history or a similar subject area discuss any sort of current events or any sort of currently controversial policy or social issues. And the bill doesn't say what is or isn't current, so it's unclear about how far out that would actually work. But you can imagine a situation last year where there was a lot of violence towards Asian Americans in this country due to the outbreak of COVID and other things. And if a teacher wanted to discuss that, they couldn't be able to do so. They also, if they choose to do so, because they're not completely forbidden, they're just forbidden from having it required. But if they want to do so, they have to do so by offering opposing views. And so one wonders, how do you offer views that are opposing when a certain group of people are being targeted for hate crimes? You may think that that is silly. You may think that that doesn't make any sense. And I agree. This is sort of what happens when legislators decide that they know how to operate better in the classroom than what teachers do. And you get some of these really confusing things that just make no sense. Another thing House Bill 322 prevents is the idea of service learning. So this idea that students can go to state government and sort of actively learn how it works and then receive credit for it. And as somebody who worked in the state legislature, you would have students all the time come in and, you know, write letters to their legislator or come to testify about the state flower or the state fossil, or you'd have high schoolers come in and intern as part of their coursework. All of that would be gone. This opportunity to interact with the state legislature, their local government, the federal government for any sort of credit is going to be removed completely from public schools. So it really stops our students from learning how policy is made, how it's developed, how they can be active in ideas that they have. Completely strips that ability for them to be involved in government whatsoever. And it's very frustrating to see that. It also prohibits requirement that teachers affirm a belief in the multiplicity or fluidity of gender identities. And this is sort of an attack on trans and non-binary students. And it's actually very worrisome because what it would essentially allow for is that a teacher or other school administrator wouldn't have to recognize things like a child's preferred pronouns. And we know that these students are already at high risk for things like being bullied. And so imagine a situation where an adult is modeling this behavior and a student sees this and then suddenly they think, well, it's okay for me to treat this person differently because my teacher or the principal or some other person in the school is doing so too. So that's another issue with House Bill 322 that we're actively looking at. And just a quick note, this bill is narrowly focused specifically on K-12 public schools only, the state board, and then the State Department of Education. So its reaches are sort of limited to those three specific areas. Next slide. House Bill 327, however, is quite different. Introduced by Representatives Fowler Arthur and Grindell, and also assigned to House State and Local Government Committee. It prohibits the teaching of what it terms divisive concepts, which are very similar to 327, but also includes what I like to call a catch-all provision. And so what that means is that in 322, you have your list of prohibitive concepts that you can teach or you can't teach, and that's essentially it. If you can find sort of a way around that, then you wouldn't be in violation of the bill. That's not the case with 327. There's a list of things that represents race stereotyping and race scapegoating that if it's not listed out in the bill but falls under those definitions, teachers can still get in trouble for them. So it's far more expansive than 322. And unlike 322, House Bill 327 applies to K-12 public schools, the Department of Education, the State Board, higher ed universities, state agencies, and political subdivisions. So it has a far broader reach. So not only is it applied to the same things that 322 does, but goes into higher education, goes into state agencies like Department of Agriculture, Department of Health, the Department of Medicaid, Addiction and Mental Health Services. Any state agency is subject to this as well as other political subdivisions. And there are penalties associated with House Bill 327, which are not present in House Bill 322. So in K through 12 education, a teacher who's found to be teaching quote unquote divisive concepts could ultimately lose their license. Schools could see up to 100% of their funding pulled from them, which is just sort of crazy when you think about the work the state legislature just did to pass a new school funding formula. They're now willing to yank that funding back if you have been found to taught a divisive concept. And higher education also has these penalties as well, but they're not as extreme as they are in K through 12. There are exceptions to the teaching of divisive concepts in K through 12 education, but they must be quote unquote nonpartisan, which isn't really defined by the bill. It doesn't represent, I think, the sort of exception that they believe that it does. So that's just an overview of House Bill 327. Go to the next slide. So here's some things to consider. First is that both bills have received significant support from members of the Ohio House, right? If you look at the co-sponsors for 322 and 327, more than half of the House Majority Caucus is a co-sponsor to one or both bills. Both bills have been assigned to the House State and Local Government Committee instead of the Primary and Secondary Education Committee. And by no coincidence, the House State and Local Government Committee Chair and Vice Chair are co-sponsors of both bills. So they have been assigned to a committee where they are more likely to get a favorable reception. For House Bill 327, both sponsors sit on the House State and Local Government Committee. So it has a very happy home in this committee where it may not have gotten the same sort of reception in the Primary and Secondary Education Committee. These bills are not about history exclusively, and we talked about wanting to make sure that people have an accurate depiction of history and as it's taught, and that's important, but that's only half of the coin. It's going to affect all diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives as well, especially House Bill 327. We're talking about initiatives that the Department of Health might be working on to address infant mortality. We are talking about a sheriff's office that wants to do implicit bias training for its deputies. You won't be able to do that under House Bill 327. It is looking at more than just the teaching of history. And in fact, if you look back at any of the hearings that these bills have had, when the supporters of these bills come to talk about these bills, they're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives are the things that they're most upset about. Having these classes that exist and their students having to go to them and have these ideas implanted into their mind that they're racist and all these other things. So it's really this DEI concept that they're very upset about. And you can even look in the news now and learn that they're starting to go after things like social and emotional learning as well, because they think it's a backdoor to critical race theory. So it's far more than just teaching history, but it's also about the diversity, equity, inclusion aspect. These bills are important. And right now we're hearing that House Bill 327 is rumored to be the front runner of one of the bills that are going to come out of the Ohio House. So we know these bills are important to the legislators from the support that they've got, but House Bill 327 has really undergone significant change over time and has seen just huge additions continue to be added to the bill, which makes us think that it's more likely than not the piece of legislation that's ultimately going to move. And we know that these will be key to upcoming primary races in the spring of 2022. We saw in the Virginia governor's race how big these issues were and playing an outcome in that. And we believe that certainly members of the legislature recognize that and want to make that a part of their campaign strategy. We do know that all the major Republican nominees for Senate have made some sort of anti-CRT statement at some point in time. So these are going to be very key to primary races coming up in spring of 2022. And so with that, I will go ahead and end my presentation. Oh, Jenny, I think you're on mute.
That keeps happening to me. So Tim, thank you so much. I was saying, although muted, that we're already getting a lot of response from the people who are watching and questions related to the topics that you were just talking about. So we'll get those questions to you, but appreciate your information and perspective. And later in the program, we'll offer specific ways to take action. Now let's focus on the State Board of Education and look at the frameworks and guardrails still in place to ensure that students are valued and respected and given the education resources and opportunities to reach their maximum potential. First, we have Dr. Antoinette Miranda. She's an elected State Board member representing District 6 and has been a member since 2016. She's a professor and director of the school psychology program at the Ohio State University, spent well over 35 years in education, both in K-12 and post-secondary. She's worked as a school psychologist in urban, suburban, and rural districts in New York City, Ohio, and Kentucky. And she has a lifelong passion for making schools work for school-age kids, especially the most vulnerable. So welcome to you. Next, we have Merle Johnson. She's an elected State Board member representing District 11 and was first elected to the board in 2016. Merle is a retired teacher with 40 years of teaching experience in the Cleveland Public Schools. She's a graduate herself of Glenville High in the Cleveland District. And in her areas of teaching, she has helped new and struggling teachers improve their skills. She also developed and conducted workshops on cultural competency and trauma-informed education to empower teachers to successfully teach all of their students. I could go on, but I will continue. So Merle, welcome to you. And then we also have Michelle Newman, a elected State Board of Education member representing District 9. She was elected to the seat in 2020. Michelle owns her own small business marketing company where she specializes in marketing strategy, template-based web design, social media marketing, and collateral design. In addition, Michelle serves as the executive director of the Canal Market District in downtown Newark, and she serves on the board of the Granville Area Chamber of Commerce and the Robbins Hunter Museum. So I'd like to welcome all of you on board, and now we'll go ahead and hear from you. We'll start with Dr. Miranda.
Thank you, Jenny. So I'm going to really talk about our strategic plan and the development of it. This is something that I'm very proud of. I thought it was one of the major accomplishments that the State Board did. We did this in conjunction and collaboration with the Ohio Department of Education. And so I just want to point out a couple of things that really make this really important. As you can see, our hashtag is Each Child Our Future, and that's what we were really focused on. The center of this plan is the whole child, and that's where everything we talk about is really looking at the whole child, not just one piece of it. There are 3 core principles, 4 learning domains, and 10 priority strategies. The thing that to me is most impressive about the strategic plan is that the people in the state of Ohio that were involved in making this happen. When we think about how it came about, there are more than 150 Ohio-based partners. This was initiated in the summer of 2017. We brought these partners together to really kind of figure out how we wanted to develop the strategic plan. We went all over the state of Ohio and had stakeholder meetings where people were able to give input. And in the end, 1,350 Ohioans had a hand in crafting the plan. And I think that's really important to understand. It wasn't just a small group. It was really everybody from all corners of the state had an opportunity to speak to this plan and talk about what they want. The 3 core principles are equity, partnerships, and quality schools. And equity to me is one of the critical pieces. We've been talking about it today. The board has talked about it a lot in the sense that we need to have equity, make sure that every child in the state of Ohio has an opportunity to be able to be successful. And oftentimes people want to equate equality and equity, and there's an important difference. Equality, and I'm going to talk about the pandemic, equality is giving everybody a laptop. A laptop doesn't matter if you don't have broadband. Equity is about making sure that those kids that don't have broadband are able to get it so they can be on the same playing field as those kids that have it. So when we look through this, I love that we're able to put this in whoever developed this was a genius, into one snapshot. And I think it's important to really look at the domains. So we have the first 4 learning domains. We have 10 priority strategies I think are important because those strategies are about how do we get there? How do we make sure that each child our future happens? And how do we get to our goal? And that goal is that we want to increase annually the percentage of its high school graduates who can, a year after graduation, be what we call a productive adult in whatever way that is. And that may be going to college, maybe going to the military. It's about having a job so that you have a living wage as you get finished. And we sort of think about that the school is where this will happen. And so when we look at these priorities, a lot of it is about having highly effective teachers. And how do we do that? And that's really connecting with higher education, making sure that we're training teachers for the world that they're going to see. And so it's also looking at who are the students that are going to be in front of you. And that's why the resolution was so important, because we wanted to make sure that teachers are able to teach any student that is in front of them, regardless of ethnicity, race, or language. It's about trying to give principal support. So ODE is about how do we make sure that principals are highly trained and giving them the leadership skills that they need. Providing teacher and instructional support, making sure that standards reflect all of the learning domains, having assessment that gauge all the learning domains. So we're always looking at that. It's about accountability. And a lot of it, when we talk about meeting the needs of the whole child, it was about social and emotional learning. That is a huge piece of this. We have many kids that are having mental health needs. As one superintendent said, I don't have a child in the hospital for COVID, but I just sent 2 students to Nationwide Children's Hospital for suicide ideation. This is real. And so social emotional learning becomes a really important piece of this in terms of meeting and addressing the mental health needs of our students. I know Merle, she'll probably mention this, her big thing is trauma, and I so agree with it. The trauma that many of our students are experiencing in schools, which leads to the mental health problems that many of our students have. So it's important that our teachers understand social emotional learning. It's important that we have the personnel related services to be able to do social emotional learning. And we also want to expand quality early learning. We know that preschool makes a difference. It has been shown in research over and over again that giving students a leg up in preschool has better outcomes later on. And then finally, because I know I only have 3 minutes trying to go through this, is that our latest project is trying to transform high schools. The strategic plan, I hope people have an opportunity to look at it, because there is kind of, we've been hearing some rumors about trying to get rid of it. The strategic plan is so critical for making sure that we address the needs of all Ohio students, regardless of the district they're in, regardless of their zip code. And a big piece of that is equity. This is something I'm very proud of. I think most of the board members that developed it, I know Laura Kohler is very proud of this when she was president and leading the charge on making this happen. And like I said, it is the one thing that everybody in Ohio, the representative population had a hand in. So I'm going to stop there because I think I probably got to my 3 minutes, even though I was talking really fast. And then I will turn it over to the next board member.
Merle, if you'd like to take your turn.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the League of Women Voters for having such wonderful forums with good information that people need to know. I'm going to, I appreciate Antoinette talking about the strategic plan. I am also very, very proud of the strategic plan and the fact that we had so many people all over Ohio having input into its success. I'm going to talk about something that I'm also very proud of, and that's the Whole Child Framework. We have a Whole Child Framework task force. We've been spending a lot of time trying to put this together to make sure that we include everything that it takes for a child to be successful. And there's basically 5 components. And if you look at the graphic, when we talk about a Whole Child Framework, we want to make sure that that child is safe, that child is healthy, the child is challenged, the child is supported, and that child is engaged. And so I just want to break down, especially I think the most important component there is safety. If a child is not safe, a child cannot learn. Antoinette mentioned trauma. The COVID created a situation that I don't think I've experienced or most people haven't experienced. And that's where 100% of our children have experienced some type of trauma as a result of COVID. 100% of our educators have experienced some kind of trauma because of COVID. And so when you look at trauma, educators who have experienced trauma, trying to teach students who have experienced trauma, it can become a very chaotic situation. And that's why trauma-informed teaching strategies are so important. When a child experiences trauma, it affects a part of the brain that it protects that child from danger. The part of the brain becomes threatened and the child is constantly in panic mode. That's going to affect a child's ability to be able to self-regulate or to. And I truly believe that it's because of the trauma that we're having so much violence and fighting in our schools today. Because when a child is experiencing trauma and they are always in a threatened mode or panic mode, that means if a child looks at you funny, you're going to want to fight because you're going to consider that a threat. And so we need to have an environment where our educators, not just the teachers, but the secretaries, the custodians, the cafeteria workers, everybody who comes in contact, the bus drivers, everyone who comes in contact with that child should receive trauma-informed training. In that way, there are no surprises. Everybody understands that if a child gets angry, they don't need to suddenly be suspended or expelled. They need to be dealt with with understanding and with trust and with love. And I know sometimes that's difficult, but in most cases, when I was teaching and I was trained in trauma-informed teaching strategies, when a child got angry, I was able to say, stop, breathe, have a seat, and we'll talk later. And 99% of the time, they would come to me and they would apologize. So when you talk about safety, when you talk about health, feeling challenged, supported, engaged, our state legislators are producing legislation that is the total opposite of what should be happening with our children. Let's take a look at 322 and 327. They create an environment that is not safe. It's not safe when a child knows that his teacher is not allowed to tell him the truth. That's just not a safe environment. Children need to be able to trust their teachers. And if I can't trust that my teacher's going to be telling me the truth, then I'm not going to feel safe. When you talk about being engaged and challenged, 322 and 327 speak against implicit bias training. And research has shown that it's implicit bias that causes many of our educators not to have high expectations of our students. Dr. Walter Gilliam, years ago out of Yale University, did some very important research in which he realized that in preschool, more African-American boys were being suspended and expelled than white children. We're talking about preschool. And what he discovered, he was able to figure this out at a conference where there were a number of preschool teachers. And he said, he told them, you're going to be watching, I'm going to do a little experiment. You're going to be watching a video where we have 4 preschool children who are playing at a table. There's 2 Black children, 2 white children, 2 girls and 2 boys. And he asked the preschool teachers to watch the video and for them to anticipate where they think something might go wrong. And at the end of the video, what he didn't tell them was that he was monitoring where their eyes were focusing. And when he lit up these red dots that showed where teachers were looking, almost all of the red dots were on the little African-American boy. And this was a group of diverse teachers, white, Black, all races. And he discovered that it was because of implicit bias that these teachers expected the little Black boy to be the troublemaker in the group. And this is what happens in our classrooms. But 322 and 327 says, no, you must not do implicit bias training. When you talk about the agencies that will be affected, Department of Health, Medicaid, that deals directly with the health of our children and the support that they can receive from these agencies. It's very, very important for our children to be challenged, to be supported, to be engaged, to be safe, and to be healthy in our classrooms if they are going to be expected to be successful. And so with that, I just want to end by saying it's so important. I appreciate former board president Laura Kohler saying we must speak up. Kayla, I love how you said we're not perfect yet, but we need to work in that direction. But these are the kinds of things that all of us should be doing. I saw in the chat where someone said they're looking at the end of public education. That's what it's all about. It's about destroying public education. And so we have to stick together and fight for our schools and fight for our students. Thank you. I also thank you for putting the screen up here. I appreciate it. I'm just going to very quickly talk about this. I was really, really impressed by this definition of equity that I found in the Worthington Schools DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion policy, because it opens a bigger picture. Their definition of equity is the intentional allocation of resources, instruction, and opportunities according to need. And here's the new part, requiring that discriminatory practices, prejudices, and beliefs be identified and eradicated. that just takes equity to a whole new level. And I just really like that definition. And if we do work on our strategic plan, we are getting to the end of our 5 years, and I know we're going to be adding to it. I'm hoping that we can add this definition because I love this definition of equity. And with that, I will end. This definition is from Worthington School's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Policy. Thank you very much, everybody.
All right, thanks, Merle. Let's go ahead and hand the microphone now to Michelle.
Deine, thank you so much. And thanks to all the partners for having us today. And also huge thanks to Laura, to Merle, and Antoinette. I am a newly elected board member to the state board, just about to complete my first year. And I am so grateful to be with these strong women because I am learning so much and I am so grateful. And it's still very humbling to be involved in these conversations. So I just kind of want to ground it in that. From where Merle picked up and the comment that had come about the attack on public education, I feel like, as Kayla pointed out, when we talk about history, we have to understand history to know where we're coming from to make sure we don't repeat it. And let's go back to very recent history, was actually when the equity resolution was rescinded by the state board a few months ago. The discussions that happened around that, I think, are incredibly important, and I highly recommend that folks go and look up our archived meetings to hear the discussions about the equity resolution and when it was rescinded, because I think you'll really see strategically why it was pointed out that I firmly believe that this resolution had to be rescinded as a piece of the puzzle to fully discredit public education and move us more to privatization. And I feel when we look through this, and I think going back a bit, I mean, I've only been on the board for a year. When I ran in 2020, I ran on this resolution. I said I fully support it. I actually represent 13 counties in the state of Ohio. Not once did I get a comment about it. Not once was I ever challenged on my support of the resolution. It was never even discussed. And what ended up happening is kind of the whole fruit of this conversation is about the politicization. And what happened is when the fight around critical race theory came up, all of a sudden this resolution was perfect to throw on the fire. Because I ran on this, I won the election without any problem ever having to fight for my beliefs and why I thought this resolution made sense. And I highly encourage individuals to go through and read the resolution. And I believe Michael had put the link to the original resolution in the chat. And I am grateful for that because it seemed like it was within hours of the resolution being rescinded that it disappeared from the internet. And so I think it is incredibly important for historical purposes that everybody goes and saves a copy of that so we can constantly refer to it and understand how well it was written and how well it addressed the issues that we are having within the state. I think it was an incredibly bold but incredibly common sense resolution that called for our institutions to take a serious look at what's going on both within the classroom and within our hiring practices. One of the things I did want to point out is, as we've talked about public education being challenged, is one of the items in the original resolution. It's actually on the second page of the resolution. It's one of the first lines at the top that talks about, and it says that the State Board of Education recognizes that public schools are fundamental to our democratic society. When we had the discussion about rescinding the resolution, this was challenged, and it was said that no, public education is not fundamental. And I think this shows you the next level of where the attacks are coming to when we're trying to make the argument that public education is not important. And I feel that as we have this conversation around the politicization of education, the question now is not what party does your representative come from? It is, do they believe in the power and the need for strong public education? And so I feel that folks really need to look into that as election season comes up, because as was mentioned before, this is going to come up in 2022. You need to ask those running for office, are you going to support our public schools and give them what they need? I also wanted to point out one other item that is in here that I think is incredibly important. And this talks about us looking at our institutions and how we look at hiring practices. When also, Kayla, I'm just going to keep quoting you. You had so many wonderful things to say when you spoke earlier. But Kayla, when you had pointed out about representation matters. We have a teacher hiring crisis in this state as is. And when we look at how many Black faces are in front of classrooms, the numbers are abysmally low. Representation matters. The resolution called for the state to look at its hiring practices, to screen for implicit bias, and to give people the opportunity to understand when they have a bias so they can overcome it. Recognizing implicit bias is not a condemnation of who you are as a person. It is an opportunity to learn and to do better. And I think we have to shift that conversation. We can all learn, we can all grow. And I believe that this is something that we need to continue to look at, is how we hire and how we're asking people to join the ranks of being teachers in the state of Ohio. It is one of the most important positions in our state, in our country, and representation matters in the classroom. And so I also feel that with the loss of this resolution, it's also a loss when it comes to looking at our hiring practices and who we're recruiting to teaching. So in the long of short, that's maybe some extra topics there that folks maybe haven't thought of when we talk about what it meant to see this resolution go away.
All right, thanks so much, Michelle. I want to thank all of our State Board of Education members for sharing more about Ohio's strategic plan for education, highlighting the whole child framework, and of course, unpacking the resolution to condemn racism and advance equity, all three frameworks working to promote the wellness, safety, and academic achievement of all Ohio students. So now we are going to zero in on one of our own local districts in Northeast Ohio to learn about how these issues are impacting student learning and their social emotional health. Here to do that, we are happy to welcome Elizabeth Kirby back to the Real Talk program. She was on in February sharing the DEI work she and school leaders are implementing at Cleveland Heights University Heights City School District. Elizabeth joined the district as superintendent in 2019. What a crazy couple of years for you. Prior to that, she served as the chief of school strategy and planning for Chicago Public Schools, spent a total of 23 years in Chicago Public Schools as a teacher, principal, and central office administrator. And now she is back in her native Cleveland. She grew up in the Shaker Buckeye neighborhood. So Liz, welcome to you, and please take it away.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity. I remember being on the panel last year, and I remember being so impressed with the resolution that the State Board adopted. I was inspired by the story that Laura told of its drafting and how, she made changes based on feedback. I just thought that was so brave and really inspiring for me. And then, we turn around and now the resolution and all the politics that have happened since then, which is clearly a sign of the times of where we are. Our district, the DEI work has been very important to our district. We're the first district in Cuyahoga County to adopt a policy in 2016. And here you'll see the elements of the policy. Goal A and Goal E in particular are at risk given this legislation that is circulating now in Columbus. If enacted, this legislation would be saying to districts, you better not talk about race or equity. You better not address the full needs of students. You better not do any training with your staff around identity or implicit bias or the history of marginalization. And if you do it, get ready to get fined and get ready to get policed. And so these bills are incredibly frustrating for me as a leader. And I will tell you, I went in, tried to testify when these, the one version of these bills were up, and there were hundreds of people there to testify. And I got a really great lesson in how politics work, because only 4 people were able to really testify. And it definitely appeared to be an attempt to not give, the hundreds of people an opportunity to state their opposition to the bill. This time in particular, it's particularly frustrating. We are talking about bills that address a problem that does not exist at all, and creating a distraction that school district leaders, administrators, teachers, and staff do not need. In fact, I personally think it's cruel because right now schools are wrestling with the academic losses students experience, the social, emotional, extreme needs that students have right now, labor shortages and staffing issues, and then on top of that, COVID part 2. And so the fact that this has caught, such popularity across the country, and now this is something that is still on its way to some form of approval, likely in Columbus, to me is an indication that there certainly are people who are making decisions that don't really care about students. Not only do they not care about public education, this has nothing to do with students. This is all politics. I can tell you from my experience, if you just go to the next slide, the work that the Cleveland Heights University High School District did engage in around equity reaped great benefit for our students. So based on a very intentional approach to looking at advanced placement enrollment and advanced placement performance, our district in the fall of 2019 was recognized as one of 250 districts in the country who earned the honor of being on the AP District Honor Roll. You get that for your AP performance and participation. And we got there with an intentional approach of opening up those AP opportunities to our African-American students and students of color in the district, right? And so given the climate that is now getting created, how many opportunities are going to be lost for other students in other districts and other schools as well? And to me, that's a true indication of the short-sighted and not strategic thinking of the state as relates to ensuring that students are fully educated and wholly educated. That is something that makes our state a better place to live, to work, and to contribute. It makes me wonder, is there an intention to try to depopulate the state of Ohio almost? All these things really kind of raise these types of questions for me. If we're trying to weaken public education, and if we are trying to limit how students are educated. So those are my comments. That's my reflection. This is something that is really dangerous in our state, and it really makes me worry in terms of the future for our students.
Thanks so much, Liz, for your perspective. It's always interesting to hear what one of our local superintendents is doing, on the ground. I know you're on the front lines with so much going on, especially during the pandemic. So I appreciate the work that you do. I'm glad that you're here. So we're going to go ahead and open this up now to everyone participating in this panel. Ohio education. Welcome. So actually, Liz, I'll just turn it straight back to you. I would love to know, I think the kind of outward perspective of DEI work as it's been kind of politicized over the last year is really just about race and history. But really, as you are describing, there is an equity tool happening here that works to raise the academic achievement, the social emotional growth of all these students. So, how much of kind of in your perspective is the DEI about, as we said, the equity for all students and the ability to teach them about things, complicated histories and things like that?
Correct. DEI work, even if you look at our equity policy, we have 6 different components to that. So it's teaching students about their histories. It's teaching staffs about their history as well, understanding the role of identity in the classroom. But it's also things like looking at how you allocate resources in your school in order to meet the needs of students. It's also about how you engage and empower families to be partners in the work. Families, specifically families from communities that have been traditionally marginalized as well. It's also about having a way to assess and hold yourself accountable to your equity work and those equity principles. So if you look at the way that your funds are being expended in the district, if you look at the way that staffing is being allocated in the district, are we reaching those students who all of our indicators show us that they need additional support in order to be successful as well? So it is really comprehensive. And the problem with this legislation, and it's very craftily written and it's been changed. It's really about making people fearful to say anything, making people fearful to do anything. And I know that there have been some districts who were planning on, bravely, putting their foot out there, taking a step out and starting some DEI work in communities where it was brand new. Generally in Cuyahoga County, the first ring, lots of districts have been doing this work. And the response, the national response, people coming to those board meetings outside of those communities to squash that has been so extreme that it has shut that work down to the detriment of students and families and staff, et cetera. So it's, it hits and it impacts everything. And it also begs the question, if this legislation passes, what's going to be the next iteration? What's going to be the amendment to the other issue? Because this, we're going, it's a slippery slope and this is headed towards a destination.
All right. Tim, I'll turn it to you. I mean, have we seen from any of the other states kind of the actual execution of these bills that have been passed? I mean, are there going to be a, conversation police that are going to go around and make sure districts aren't teaching history as it is? Or is this, as Liz is mentioning, and Dr. Miranda just said, is this really about fear and a chilling effect on local school districts or any sorts of organizations that might want to, throw out an anti-racism statement or, advocacy for equity work? How do you see this potentially being executed? And will its prongs be kind of into everything that, let's say, Superintendent Kirby's working on at CHUH?
So I will go ahead and say, yeah, it's 100% about the fear of doing anything. Certainly there may be situation in which parent or a student may want to raise a concern about something they've learned in class, and they would certainly have the mechanisms if one of these bills passed to do so. But really what you're probably going to see is teachers and administrators just being like, I don't want to touch this. I don't want to get involved with this. I don't want to discuss this. A kid comes in and says, you never guess what I saw in the news last night, and wants to have a conversation about it. Why bother doing that? If my license is at risk, if school funding's at risk, I'm just going to tell them that that's something they're going to have a discussion with somebody after class, off school property, what have you. So I don't necessarily think that there will be roving gangs of people trying to peek into classrooms and finding out what's happening, or maybe parents won't be sitting their kids down and say, tell me everything you learned today so I can figure out, what exactly you were taught and how this happened. But I do think that you will just have this huge chilling effect in a sense where any sort of progressive idea that people want to bring into the classroom, it's just going to be blatantly ignored because people are so worried about the consequences of doing so. And I really think that that's the setup that you're going to see in Ohio.
I'll go ahead and thank you for that. I'll go ahead and turn it to our Board of Education members now. Speaking of chilling effect, I mean, I think that a lot of Ohioans and people across the country really kind of were surprised to see about this extreme step that was taken when Laura was forced to resign from her presidency role. I mean, she appeared on CNN. It made national news that the legislature would force her hand in that way. So what kind of effect has this had on your board and your mission to execute the kinds of goals and types of missions that you had when something like this can happen and two appointed members essentially forced to resign because of politics? I'll open it up to any of the board members. Just unmute yourself if you want to.
Well, I know Merle's going to speak up, but one of the things that after the resolution was rescinded, and I think it's very true, she said the work it will continue. And I think that's what's true. The work is going to continue. I've talked to both of them about this. The next board meeting, we looked at our data that they had and looked after COVID. And no surprise, Black and brown children, children in poverty had lost and their numbers had dropped. And what was so interesting to me was that all of a sudden everybody was what I call admiring the data and saying, what are we going to do? These groups have dropped. And I thought to myself, that was the anti-racism resolution. So, you know, it's still there. Because we send it doesn't mean the issues went away. They are still there. So as a board, our goal is to continue to look at how can we make sure that all children have an opportunity to be successful in the state of Ohio. But it will take what I think are really brave people to stand up and do the right thing. And that's the thing that I know that we have pledged to do, is to continue to fight to make sure that all students have the opportunity to be successful. And part of that is really fighting for equity.
Yeah, I was so happy to see the president of Cleveland Heights School Board, Jim Posh, to come to our public participation this week. I was so happy to see him. He talked about the great equity work that Cleveland Heights is doing. Kudos to Superintendent Kirby and her team and the educators there. But we need more people. And that's since we have folks on this program who are interested in equity and diversity and inclusion, we need you to take a little trip to Columbus and to come on the second Tuesday of each month, 9 o'clock in the morning, to testify about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We cannot make it seem like because the resolution was rescinded that this topic has died. You know, it's just been so silent since October 13th. We didn't have anybody during public participation in November. And I said, oh my goodness, have people given up? So, you know, we really need you to come. It's a 2.5-hour ride for me. You know, I don't know where you live, but it's not that bad. You know, stick a little book of tape or some music or something and just ride along. And really, we need you to come to Columbus to testify about the importance of equity and diversity and inclusion. We really need you to come.
Michelle, do you want to add to kind of, what they have been saying about, you know, kind of the politics at play this year? And, you know, I guess the perception would be, was there a chilling effect? Or, you know, is there a mission to make sure the strategic plan is actualized as much as it can be over the next several years? You all are searching for a state superintendent. You know, how are the politics of the board now, you know, impacting that? And what, you know, remains to be kind of the focus at hand?
Right. Well, as Dr. Miranda mentioned, and Merle as well, the work was already happening before the resolution was ever passed. And so I feel that what we need to do, and I feel that those of us, and I feel that we have to be really careful too of demonizing certain individuals on the board saying you're not supporting kids. Because I think if you look really closely, the majority of individuals on that board are trying to do the best for kids. And then we just have to reframe it and keep going. You know, I am not going to let this stop us from doing the work that we have to do. We can't just throw up our hands and say, this is awful, you know, and stomp our feet and walk away. We have to say, okay, well, let's keep going. How do we do this? And the fact is, when you listen to the discussions on the state board, so often it comes down to data. We'll take that data and keep telling the story, keep showing where the fires are so we can say we have to address this. And we hear the conversations that have come up in the board, people are like, oh, look at these numbers. Maybe we should be doing something to take care of this. Yeah, we did. You rescinded it, you know? And so it's like, we're just gonna keep working. And so as Merle pleaded, please come and participate. We know that it can be difficult sometimes for people to come in person. You can actually even submit written testimony that would go in the public record, that would go into our board books. You can send that over to the state board and have that go into our board book for a given month. So if you're unable to be with us in person, you can do that. But I feel that the fact is the will of the board and I truly, and I'm a unicorns and rainbows person, I'm going to keep working like we can bring people along to get this work done. And that's what I'm going to do in my time on the board. And I feel that there are many others who are like that as well. So I know that a lot of this conversation is very difficult. Please do not give up hope, because we are not stopping.
Thanks, Michelle. I think Michelle makes a great point in the fact that, every Board of Education member in their mind has, the children's best interests at heart, but come at it from a different perspective. I wonder how you do talk to, Ohio and the parents that have such different perspectives about, is critical race theory taught in my classrooms? And why would you want to blame white kids for, the atrocities and the wrongs that they weren't even connected with? And why can't you just tell all kids that they're great and all of that? So how do you kind of, let the populace know that DEI and that teaching history can be taught with nuance, with sensitivity, with care for a young person who, is still kind of learning about the world around them, but that it's important still can be present in the schools now.
Yeah, I think those are really important questions. And I know that my former colleagues on the board, all of them, believe in how critical parents are to this group of people who are there to support their children. So clearly, we've got to provide an arena so that people can come together and share their opinions and respect the diversity that we're hearing in these opinions. But I think as I listen to this conversation, perhaps with a little bit of perspective now, I think that we need to be strategic in how we move forward. I believe that this discussion about critical race theory and DEI is the tip of the iceberg. I believe that there are those who are extremely well organized and very well funded, who have an agenda that probably will take on the state board's strategic plan in the very near future. I think it's foolish to think that that is not going to be the next step. And what concerns me once they start digging into the strategic plan, and the entree will be through what Dr. Miranda described as one of the 3 principles of the plan, and that is equity. That will be the way to discredit the strategic plan. And I think the next step then, following that, if we are not prepared, is that they will begin to question the importance of social emotional learning. I think that there is a real desire to move public education back to reading, writing, and arithmetic and leave everything else out of the picture. So I think during my time on the board, I was fairly naive in many ways about what was actually happening. I tend to believe in unicorns and rainbows as well, Michelle. And I assumed that all of the actors were acting on behalf of the best interests of children. I don't think that's necessarily the case anymore. Certainly, and I'm not talking about the board specifically, I'm trying to include some of the people introducing legislation in the General Assembly in this as well. I think that they believe that we kind of need to go back to the way things used to be. And there's going to be a concentrated effort to erode all of the progress that we have made in recent years and slow down the pace of positive change. So that's where I could use some help from folks, is how do we really think strategically about where this is actually headed, and what do we do to change that direction?
And Jenny, I know that we're going to have some action steps at the end, but when you mention parents, there's something that parents of younger children can be doing right now. I was invited to Lake Erie College to talk about the resolution condemning hate and racism. And during that conversation, I showed a short video called Explaining Systemic Racism. And at the end of the video, I put up pieces of paper, and there were 15 students there, one Black and the rest white. And I asked them to write down examples of systemic racism in different areas: community, housing, criminal justice, and so forth. And so we had a conversation about it. And at the end, I said, so talk about something that you learned that you didn't know before. And every student talked about something that they had never heard of before. And at the end, one of the white students waited behind. And she said to me, I grew up in a small community. She said, I never knew any of this existed. And that's something that I think is so important. Parents, if you want your children to grow up respecting differences, you have to expose them to people who look different than they do when they're young. And that can be done, anywhere, at the zoo or Boys and Girls Club or whatever. But that's one of the problems, is that we don't get to be with anybody else other than our own race. Then when we grow up, sometimes it's hard to accept people who are different. So I just wanted to put that out there, because the young girl, when she said that, it really opened my eyes. So that's one of the biggest problems.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Merle. So, of course, we're out of time, which makes me.
Don't forget Kayla. You didn't ask.
Oh,
Kayla
no. No. I was going to Kayla. I was giving Kayla the last word. Don't you worry. So Kayla, you've been hearing all of these adults who essentially have spent their lives, trying to create educational opportunities for students like you. So I don't know. I would love to hear you tell us, what I know you're watching. Students like you are watching these adults in the room, create policy on your behalf, decide what education is good or not good for you. So tell us, what would you like the adults in the room to know about what you expect for your education and for your opportunity?
Okay, so one of the most important things I think a lot of adults don't realize is, I saw a lot of people in the comments that were almost praising me, like, oh my God, like you're so intelligent the way that you speak. I appreciate you coming out and speaking this way. And the fact is, I'm just like most of my peers. A lot of people like me, a lot of people that are the same age as me, they are also into this. Most of my friends are also socially active, and they agree with me. They want to see more representation in schools, and they speak out too. So I feel like that, of course, like, it's great, the conversations that we're having now, but I would like to see the student voice more included in everything, because just like you saw me speak, there are people who are even more passionate than me, or just as passionate as me, and want to see as much change as I do. So I think starting there and including more young people in the conversation is a great start.
Well, you did a great job tonight, and I do appreciate you participating again, all of you for being here. I could honestly ask you questions all night long, but we've got some limits. So thank you all for participating and for being a part of this conversation. We know we've got some questions from listeners about how they can participate in public hearings and whatnot. Tim, there was specifically one for you that announce the next training date for testimony preparation against HBs 322 and 327. Can you say that quickly?
Yes, we will be working with Honesty for Ohio Education to schedule that next date. And then when that comes out, they'll certainly send out a notification, and happy to teach folks how to testify and all of that good stuff when that opportunity arises.
All right, thanks so much. Okay, Cynthia Peoples, Chair of the Real Talk Program and State Board member of the League of Women Voters of Ohio, will walk us through some immediate ways you can take action at the Statehouse, State Board of Education, and local school districts. Hey, Cynthia.
Hey, thank you, Jenny, and a warm thanks to all of our panelists for their work and leadership around these very important issues. Now, I'm going to quickly walk through some ways that you all can advocate at the state and local levels. Michael Barron will continue dropping links into the chat specifically for these toolkits that you'll see here on the screen, and we will be emailing these out as well. So let's start at the Statehouse. So the first step in advocating against the divisive concept legislation is to learn the details and provisions of each of those bills so that you have a deeper understanding about the implications so that you can answer questions about it. From there, we encourage everyone to prepare opponent testimony and do that right now. We say right now because the House State and Local Government Committee can call for testimony on 322 or 327 at any time and not give you very much notice. So you want to be ready to hit send when that testimony is called for. Do not submit it ahead of when that testimony is called for, though. It will be sent back. Now, thankfully, in those take action links you're going to see here in the chat, you will find links to testimony workshops that Tim with the Ohio Poverty Law Center, Rachel Coyle at Innovation Ohio, and the ACLU Ohio have done. You can go ahead and walk through those. They're fantastic. They give a lot of great information, more details on the bills, and they actually do some role playing so that you can get familiar and get a sense of what it will be like at the Statehouse. There's also links to sample testimony in those toolkits and a lot of great talking points to give you a launching pad on where you can start crafting your own testimony. From there, what we're going to ask is that you actually convert your testimony into a letter to the editor or an op-ed, or you can actually write a fresh piece to submit to our area newspapers. We also suggest writing and phoning members of the state and local government committee to directly voice your opposition to these bills, and also contact your own state representative and senator in your local area. It's important to note that if these bills do make it out of the House committee, they will hit the House floor for a vote and potentially advance over to the Senate. So we need to create surround sound about why these bills must not pass out of the committee, or certainly not pass out of one of our legislature chambers. And we always want to advocate for honesty and education, and especially education that centers the student experience and not political agendas. Now, for the State Board of Education, you can begin by digging into those frameworks that you learned about tonight. The Each Child, Our Future Strategic Plan, the Whole Child Framework, the Anti-Racism and Equity Resolution. You can take a step further. You can read about Ohio's plan to diversify the teaching profession. There is actually a plan in place for that, and the equitable framework in place to support our students with differing learning and physical abilities. We also want to share, this is pretty exciting news, that just this week, the Ohio Department of Education announced that it's seeking 150 educators, community partners, and families to join what they're calling the Whole Child Network. Now, this is your chance to engage in this groundbreaking framework and help shape what educating the whole child will actually look like across the state of Ohio, and be a partner in this. Now, we're also, just like our state board member said, encouraging folks to attend those state board meetings and submit and present public comment. You can either do that in writing or go there and present live in person. The board does meet every second Monday and Tuesday of the month, with public comment presented on Tuesday, as Michelle pointed out. Now, again, this is your opportunity to tell the board members what's important to you in education. Like, what experience and core competencies would you like to see in the next state superintendent? You can tell the board why equity, diversity, inclusion, cultural representation in education, affirmation of identities, and anti-racism should remain a priority for the state board, because it's certainly still a priority for thousands of families and students in Ohio who do not have the luxury of looking away from it. And submit those letters to the editor. Our hardworking newspapers and media outlets like Ideastream, those are our megaphones really for championing honesty and education, and we have to keep that drumbeat going. And in your local school districts, learn about what your district is doing around DEI and honest education. Does your district have policies or initiatives in place? Reach out to your board members and ask how to get those started. Offer your support and resources for work that already is in place. And we also encourage you to attend those local school board meetings to really understand the issues and priorities in your district. Offer public comment again, share your feedback and your support for initiatives already in place. And again, use our media outlets for those letters to the editor to amplify why this work needs to be foundational, not topical and not fleeting, and why it shouldn't be used as a political football to drive division and discord. Ultimately, no matter where you choose to advocate at the Statehouse, the State Board of Education, or our school districts, we should all unite around providing high quality education that is grounded in facts and diverse perspectives, and one that always reflects all of the cultures and identities that have helped shape this nation. Now, what's great is that you can head over to the Honesty for Ohio Education website for all of these resources and networking to advocate and learn more about these issues. Honesty for Ohio Education is a statewide coalition made up of nearly 30 state and local organizations that are all galvanizing around protecting honesty and education. And we have a tremendous amount of community members that are also working in these spaces as well. Here you can sign up for our weekly newsletter and action alerts, and to hear about testimony workshops like Tim was talking about. You can also get notified about when testimony is called for 322 and 327. Sign up for events, educational programs, workshops, and teach-ins that'll be just around the corner that are all designed to build knowledge and capacity around serving our Ohio students to the best of our ability. And then plug into our Youth and Young Adult Coalition. Woo-woo! Now, it is my strong belief that it is our younger generation that will save us from ourselves if we just get out of their way. Kayla is a shining example of that, and her peers. You can also find Honesty on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And I'll just quickly wrap up. If you're interested in learning more about any of the leagues of women voters that put this program together, or any of our incredible community partners, you can head over to their websites or contact us by email and phone. And finally, I just want to personally thank Jenny Hamill for being an outstanding moderator and always providing Ohio with exceptional, fact-driven reporting and compelling storytelling. We are so grateful for the integrity and professionalism that you bring to your work and these programs. Jenny, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Cynthia. I appreciate that. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us tonight for this important civic conversation, and a special thanks to all of our panelists, Kayla Blake, Laura Kohler, Tim Johnson, Dr. Antoinette Miranda, Merle Johnson, Michelle Newman, and of course, Elizabeth Kirby. Thank you all for taking your time and sharing your perspective with us today, and for the work that you do generally. A quick reminder that this recording, slide deck, and a list of resources from tonight's event will be emailed to all registrants and uploaded to the Real Talk website. Be sure to visit honestyforohioeducation.info to stay on top of these very important issues. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great night, and we will see you at the next forum.